I want to sincerely thank Steph Tai for joining us today and for being willing to talk with us about an incredibly important vote that's coming up. Steph Tai is a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin, working on the intersections between environmental, food, and health sciences and administrative law. Steph has a chemistry background, MIT undergraduate and Tufts PhD, and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. Prior to teaching at UW-Madison, they worked as editor-in-chief of the International Review for Environmental Strategies, served as a law clerk to the Honorable Ronald Lee Gilman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, served as an appellate attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice as well. Steph also actively represents Amici in federal circuit court and Supreme Court cases, including Massachusetts versus EPA, the first climate change case brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, and County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund, a recent case in which their co-authored amicus brief was cited. From 2013 to 14, Professor Tai served as a Supreme Court Fellow as a researcher in the Federal Judicial Center, and we are really thankful and honored to have you here and to learn from you today. So with that, Steph, I turn it over to you.
Thank you for such a kind introduction, Nancy, and thank you for being here to listen to me on Friday. I'm going to first talk about why climate change is such a pressing issue, even though you probably all know this already, but I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk about divestment in general, because the focus of this is on the divestment resolution that is coming up before vote by Faculty Senate on Monday. And then I'll talk about this particular resolution and its contents, and then how faculty resolutions work in general, because I think sometimes it's not very clear, the whole administrative structure of the university and everything. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll just open up for questions. So I don't expect to be talking the entire hour or anything, or at least I'll be talking, but hopefully I'll be answering our questions rather than just lecturing. So why address climate change? Many of you probably know this, all of you probably know this, but it's posing many different threats from all different areas, from health effects, including the suggested rise of pandemics such as these, from other health effects such as sort of both disease related, heat stroke related, changing temperature related in terms of sort of the changing Gulf Stream. All of these things can create huge health effects. It has also huge biodiversity effects, right? You have entire habitats that are dying because of climate change, because plants, it turns out, can't adapt that quickly in terms of rapid changes that we're seeing now in climate. It has a number of other effects, including both food effects, right? So one of the things that I study is agricultural law, and we're already seeing huge shifts in terms of what can be grown where. We're seeing increased salinization of water, which means that water that used to be accessible for farming related purposes is now no longer so accessible. And so all of these are huge reasons to sort of address climate change before it's too late. And on that last note, the UN just put out a report assessing just as in literally, I think just yesterday, put out a report emphasizing the urgency of addressing this, looking at they did an overview of all of the sort of countries who committed to the Paris Agreement's sort of goals, and they've concluded that that's still not going to help address the worst effects of climate change, and that we only have 10 months to really rapidly increase our, I know it's really depressing, to really rapidly increase our approach. And so divestment is just one tool. I recognize there are so many tools and we need to be using all of them. But what is divestment? The idea is that institutions with huge sort of investment portfolios, such as UW-Madison, will sort of stop funding fossil fuels. There's been some sort of so we're here at a university, so there's a lot of academic literature about the effectiveness of divestment. But one thing too, so part of that hasn't really played out yet because divestment efforts have only been occurring for the last 10 years. And so it's hard to fully study, the effects of a divestment. But one thing has been shown. It is not a danger to the fiscal investment. They've not shown any kind of increased risk, and sometimes decreased risk. There's sometimes decreased risk seen in terms of divesting from fossil fuels. And that's because the fossil fuel industry is becoming an increasingly risky investment, with more countries giving further regulations on it, and with, again, lots of people, if the more people start divesting and the more institutions start divesting, the riskier these sort of assets are. And so there's a sort of avalanche effect that can happen through divestment. The other thing too about divestment is that it is just, like I said, one thing that institutions can do, but many major institutions are already doing it. We have many peer institutions that are doing it. Churches like the Episcopal Church of the United States have done it. The Islamic Society of North America has done it. The American Public Health Association has done it. So if we were to approve of this resolution, and if we were to actually divest from fossil fuels in the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation portfolio, we would be among many. We would just be one institution among many. But again, this is a sort of partnership kind of approach. That's the idea of divestment. This particular resolution, I want to talk about this further. So what we call for is we call for the University of Wisconsin Madison Alumni Foundation to work on divesting from fossil fuels. So to establish a clear plan and timetable to fully divest from fossil fuels, as well as develop a fossil-free alternative for donors. We request that the Wisconsin Foundation disclose its fossil fuel assets and investments for the purpose of full transparency for the faculty, university and academic staff, students, donors, etc. And we request one further thing. So far, what I've mentioned has been in line with many of the other institutions' divestment approaches. So when other institutions, like for example, the University of Maryland, Oregon State, UC system, University of California system, when they've had their sort of faculty senate resolutions, they had a similar kind of approach to asking for their universities to divest. We're actually including one thing more. And again, it's because of the urgency of this right at this moment in time. So we're also trying to get the university to leverage its buying power to reduce the carbon in our entire supply chain. So we have a part of our resolution that asks that UW-Madison should work with UW-Madison purchasing units and the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability to assess available opportunities for carbon reduction in its procurement processes. And that means buying energy, that means our sort of transportation fleets, it means maybe our paper supply, all of that. Procurement is a tricky thing because we are actually bound, because as a public institution, to a number of different state guidelines about this. So we recognize that this will take some work to do that. But the idea is to work on this plan and publish this and plan this within 2 years, so that again, we move forward rapidly in terms of decreasing our carbon footprint on the world, and by sort of giving incentives to sort of those who want to market stuff to UW to reduce the carbon in their footprint. These kinds of efforts are already starting to have some effect. So while no institution, at least that I know of, educational institution, has had a procurement kind of provision, a number of states have started greening their procurement. And that's led to things like car companies, like actually announcing that they are going to move to full electrical vehicles by 2035. That's also led to companies such as Shell, not Exxon, but Shell, to say that they're to invest more in renewable energy. So some of this, I suspect, is already having an effect. Again, efforts have been recent enough that it's hard to do a sort of full-on economic comparison, but I would suggest that this is an important effort. So that's my sort of quick thing about our resolution. It's similar to others in that we are trying to use our investments in a way that is greener, but it's also different in that we're pushing forward on also looking at our purchasing power. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is how faculty resolutions work in general, because many of you might not be really aware of university governance. I certainly wasn't in my pre-tenure before I was a faculty senator. And we only have so much power. The sponsors of this resolution, which includes me, we're aware of that. It has persuasive force, but it's not like we can, by approving of this resolution, it automatically directs the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation to immediately divest, nor does it automatically direct UW-Madison to green its procurement process. But it has persuasive effect. There's been resolutions that have been passed in by the Faculty Senate in the past that have led to working groups that have led to subsequent changes. I was on a working group to study, and this is to shift gears entirely, to study sort of queer and trans health investments, or not investments, but sort of care for university workers and students and stuff like that. And the report that we put out was actually used by Chancellor Blank in urging ETF, the Employee Trust Funds, which is the Wisconsin state agency that deals with our healthcare, to remove some of the transgender exclusions and also to shift the price for PrEP drugs, which is the drugs that you use for if you're HIV positive, to sort of lower the price point for it. So that had an actual effect. It took a lot of work, but one of the things that faculty resolutions can do is sort of get the ball rolling. And so that's why we're starting here with this effort. That's it. Any questions?
Feel free to mute yourself if you have any questions that you want to ask. Alternatively, if you don't feel like speaking up, you can always message me or Nancy or Steph with your question.
Larry, please.
Yes, I could only stay for another 15 minutes or so, so I want to get my question into Steph. When I presented this to our faculty, when it was first read, there were some questions that came back about, well, how is this going to implicate support for research funding, and a concern that this was going to somehow undermine the amounts that are available. And then a story was told about the Venner Gren Foundation, that there was a kind of cost benefit analysis made of a similar sort of initiative. And it turned out that this would eventuate in less money than what they expected for support of research. So I guess I'd like some suggestions, if I need to account to my faculty about why this is a good idea, despite what risk it might have for the availability of research funds. If you have anything on that, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, so I have links in the FAQ, in the frequently asked question file that I posted in the chat, to more recent economic studies that show very little risk posed by financial risk posed by divestment. The earlier studies suggested that there might be some kind of risk, and so maybe that's what you're looking at. But as divestment efforts have continued, they've actually shown that there's less risk posed by portfolios that don't involve fossil fuels. And there's a very in-depth Canadian study that I cite in the FAQ. I just don't remember what it is right now. Oh yeah. Also, there's a sort of financial advisory and asset management firm, Lazard, which is a large global management firm that has also sort of forecasted, sort of the prices of carbon-based energy generation versus wind-based energy generation. And they show that the trend in the cost of renewables is actually much less, and that is going to lead to more people using renewables, and thus that's a more stable form of asset versus fossil fuel assets. So that's also cited in the FAQ. Does that answer your questions? Great, thank you.
Steph, could I ask if you're aware? Oh, sorry, Simone, go ahead, please.
No, I have a very small question, which is, do you have any sense of what's your sense of how this will play out politically in the state?
So politically in the state, I mean, I guess part of it is just going to depend on how the coverage of it is, right? Wisconsin State Journal has been, I've talked to them in the past about a lot of sort of environmental matters, and I think their coverage of it will be nice. Now, the thing of it is that, there might be pushback definitely from sort of some of the sort of more conservative folks. We put a lot of justification in terms of the sort of business end of things into our frequently asked question files to allay those kinds of concerns. There is, yes, a sort of almost political reactionary thing. I don't think it's founded in actual fiscal concerns. So, that is, that's going to be there. And I'm not sure how to get around it. On the other hand, right, there are some sectors, for instance, our agricultural sector in our state, they're figuring out ways to talk around, right, climate change, which is such a laden word. There's a task force that's already been formed, I think just recently, that includes farmers from all sorts of political inclinations and to talk about the effects of climate change without mentioning the words climate change. And so I do think that if we sort of develop a task force for implementing this that is around sort of reduction of financial risk, it could work.
Noah, please.
It's also worth noting that the last time we tried this divestment thing was in 2014. In between 2014 and now, have we had a particularly friendly legislature? No. I mean, I think that the question of like, will this bias the legislature against us needs to be weighed against what the legislature's position on the University of Wisconsin-Madison tends to be in general. And I'm not sure that it's worth avoiding controversy with the legislature over climate change in the hopes that that will somehow make them more friendly towards us.
And just to let everyone know, Noah is also one of the co-sponsors of this resolution.
So could I ask what is happening potentially on the student and staff sides as well? Is this faculty led or?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so there was an independent effort on the part of the students. So the students, equivalent of the faculty senate, already passed a resolution early last fall requesting divestment. So that's already passed. The staff assembly, the academic staff assembly at least, is using this same language of the resolution. They're voting on that too. So the student end of things doesn't include procurement. Our end of things does. We've also modified our procurement requests since the initial first reading after talking to the Office of Sustainability to work out language that can be implemented more easily.
I'd like to just comment for myself as a staff member. I can't comment overall. In fact, I'd like to get information on this staff group looking at this issue. I'm the Peace Corps recruiter on campus, and I'm very concerned about this issue. And I made sort of a laughable attempt to call the Wisconsin Investment Board and, express my concerns, and they kind of just blew me off. It was amusing in many ways, but not very satisfying. So yeah, I would love to get more information on how to work with the staff overall. And thank you so much for having this session today.
And the Peace Corps is one of those organizations that has fully divested too. So
it's not the Peace Corps, it's the National Peace Corps Association, which is, and in fact, that was as a result of efforts that I made with the RPCVs for environmental action back several years ago, and they did institute these ESGs. Thank you. I was thrilled to see that in the document that you sent.
No, thank you. We need to really do everything we can at this point. Alana?
Hi, yeah, I had a question about what will be like the path forward after this is voted on in the faculty senate. So I know you said you guys have a bit of persuasive power sort of, but I'm wondering, are there like distinct next steps where this will go past that, or like what entity will look at it after it is approved, hopefully by your side of things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're actually working with the Nelson Institute to host an actual workshop on path forward too after this. Should the resolution pass, they said they would host one, and then we could talk about different ideas. But the things that have happened after prior resolutions is one, creation of a faculty working group, and that includes sort of usually who selects the working group. It sort of is people are selected to include various experts on campus regarding either divestment for the divestment prong or procurement for the procurement prong. So that'll probably be the first step, and then they will put together a report. The timeline is usually around 8 months, sort of more concretely defining what the university should do. At the same time, again, it's not like we have the authority to make the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation do anything, but they have a mix of different board members. Some of them are sympathetic, some of them are not. The sympathetic ones can use what we put together as a report to use to persuade the other ones from in between, in the background. And so our hope is that this will allow them to make the arguments to the overall board with more strength than without this kind of both faculty, academic staff, university staff, and student support. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I think it's worth saying that also this effort appears to have lit a fire under existing procurement discussions. Things that were already happening, particularly through the Office of Sustainability, seem to be happening faster now and moving along faster. And I think that that's a real concrete direction, which regardless of faculty task forces, et cetera, that is likely to move along quicker as a result of this, probably as a result of this conversation even being had, but particularly if the resolution passes.
Yeah, the folks in the Office of Sustainability have said that just the threat of this passing has already allowed them to work more strongly with the sort of purchasing offices to green their supply chain. Yeah.
I just want to make one quick comment. There's currently a student group across 13 UW system schools that has a current campaign for divestment from fossil fuels with reinvestment to more sustainable companies. Currently, they have a petition. If you want to sign that petition, the link is in the chat. And if you want to get involved or learn more, you can email Isaac Skind at skin@wis.edu. But yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know about that.
Great,
And
thank
sorry
you.
if my
Yeah,
mic is too low.
No, that's great. And we've been loosely in touch with the student groups, although working fairly independently because our resolution looks nothing at all like their resolution. We've also had requests from other Wisconsin UW campuses to sort of look at our language because I think some folks are finding the sort of procurement language really interesting. And so this could end up, if it passes, being a model at other universities.
In terms of this passing, what right now are you seeing as kind of key barriers or steps that can be rapidly taken on the part of those of us who haven't been involved before?
I'm going to turn to Noah on that because he had to present it because although I'm a faculty senator, I got scheduled to teach a class that starts sort of in the middle of the faculty senate meeting. So I was gone by the time the first reading was had. So Noah, what were your observations?
I think we have good momentum, but I think we have to fight the tendency of the faculty senate to want the perfect thing. And to be worried about this detail or that detail or the other detail. So for instance, there's been a lot of discussion, good discussion, for instance, around language about the sort of US-centric language in the resolution. Steph, which is, I realize is a change that we discussed, but I did not change that language. So it's still the old way in the resolution. It's possible for the discussion in the faculty senate to get really bogged down in like, shouldn't we have more data on this? Or doesn't this need to be a little different or a little better? Or don't we want to do this first? And I think that given the political nature of this statement, and I don't mean partisan, but the political tool that the symbolic political tool that a resolution is, we get more from making this happen now than we do for making some abstract, more perfect resolution happen in the future. And so I would say that time is short at this point, but if you have colleagues that are thinking and talking about this, if they want to dip their oar in, they're going to do it. But just encourage them to preface whatever comments and changes they want to make by saying, I fully support this resolution in any form, in its current form, and I think that we could tweak X to make it better, just so that discussion about perfecting the resolution doesn't become a tool for delaying it, which I think is the possibility that worries me the most.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even a tool. People just lose track sometimes in faculty senate. So that's another thing that happens. I'm going to post a link to the faculty senate roster in case you want to look up any senators that you might know and contact them about the vote. So there's a link in the chat.
Steph, Noah, and Nancy, I want to thank you for this very informative session, for the links, but I have to go and I'll be in support of this and I'll do what I can to get other people to support it.
Great, thank you so much. It was great.
Okay.
So what other
So,
question do folks have?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, Alan Carroll, Department of Geoscience. I don't think anybody here would argue with the goals involved in terms of climate change. I think that's fairly self-evident. I'm wondering about other means to achieve the same end, though. For example, in the past, there have been successful shareholder movements at companies like Chevron to demand greater accountability from management to the company, basically working from the inside rather than just shedding their stock and becoming less involved. Do you have any background on that, or is that something that sounds familiar?
Yeah, no. Well, so one, this resolution is directed at what we can do. And I think that divestment does create that same kind of pressure that those who are fighting from within can use as leverage for sort of investing into renewables, right? Sort of the increased risk by divestment. But that said, actually, funny that you ask about this. One of my professors, when I took some law and policy classes at Tufts, is actually one of the lead attorneys doing these sort of shareholder kind of actions. And so if you want to find out more, I can send you some links to the work that he does. It's shifted since, so the Trump administration took a bunch of approaches to SEC disclosures that made it more difficult to raise these kind of shareholder actions. But Biden administration has already said they're going to try to shift that back. So, but that the fight from within is important. There's other kinds of things that I personally work on that I think are important. I teach advanced contracts as well as environmental law. And one of the things that I've been working with is working with the Environmental Law Institute and a professor at Vanderbilt to develop model contract terms for companies that want to have a greener supply chain. So how do you ensure that your suppliers are reducing their carbon footprint? We're trying to develop terms for them because it turns out that there are companies that want to do that, but they don't want to invest the sort of legal effort into figuring out how to do that. So our idea is to try to do that for them. So there's definitely many different angles to take. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Chiming in on that, I think this is always a both and all fronts discussion. It's using all the tools we have to try to advance the conversation and apply pressure in the ways that we can, because we are not actually in control of divestment as the faculty senate. Part of what we're doing is through this symbolic political action, trying to get investors to apply the sort of political pressure you're talking about from within through a threat of withdrawal of resources. So I think that these things are not as separate as they appear. I think that Alan, I think that we're all interested in the most effective strategy. We're just using the tools that we can as folks who don't actually sit in those meetings.
I will post a link to my former professor's website, which does a lot of stuff on shareholder action and corporate accountability, in case you're interested.
Great.
So Stefano, I'm going to ask another question while other people think about theirs. I don't mean to look beyond divestment for a second, because I understand that this may not, we'll have to see what happens. But as you said, this is something around which we have some symbolic power, not necessarily direct control. What are other things that you're hoping that faculty, staff, and students might take active steps to do here on campus to try to address the roles that we play in supporting the fossil fuel regime?
Right. Well, so other things that we can do is, we as educators can control what we teach, right? And incorporating climate change, the understanding of the urgency of climate change, the understanding of ways to mitigate climate change and to adapt to climate change is something that we can all do individually. I've even worked on that in my advanced contracts class, where I have students discuss, how to sort of do risk management in contracts in light of the fact that you might be procuring a supply in some area that is under climate risk because, it's some island nation. And so, doing that, I think, raises the urgency and saliency of climate change in our students' minds. And I think that is important to do. There's other things that we can do too. We can sort of, again, in our role as educators, we can plan more sort of events discussing both the urgency of climate change, but also how to sort of discussing renewable energies. The Wisconsin Energy Institute has hosted a number of events on that, and that's another thing that we can sort of support. And so I think there's a lot of other things too, if we think of our capacity as educators, that we can use to sort of both emphasize the urgency, but also emphasizing individual types of actions that we can take.
So just to build on that, I think that for all of us, the question is, if we were thinking about doing something about this, can we do it sooner than we were planning? So if you're thinking about teaching about this or writing about this or contributing to it in some way, how about next year? How about next semester? How about the summer? And all of us are obviously feeling totally swamped, overwhelmed, beleaguered by the disruptions of the past year and a half, the many disruptions, tragedies of the past year and a half. But this is really a case where we get, it's time sensitive and path dependent. And the sooner we put in whatever little contribution we're going to make as educators, the more that contribution has a chance to be magnified later on. I also think it's worth it for all of us asking how we can shift discourse so we don't get stuck in the normal ways. So for instance, oftentimes when you bring up climate change, there is still a bid in many conversational contexts to make the existence of climate change or the reality of climate change a controversial issue. I think that we can deny that bid and just say, I believe that there's still a valid conversation to be had around appropriate responses to this reality. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that controversy and not accept, to refuse the line, to use a military term, and to not accept that, that the previous thing is controversial anymore, because it's time for us to stop fighting that battle.
I agree. Thank you.
I had another question and just a quick statement. I actually work at the Wisconsin Energy Institute in the Education and Outreach Department, and we use like this tool called En-ROADS. It's a climate simulator model for like what the temperature will be by 2100 and a bunch of other different graphs. And we use it a lot with teachers in Wisconsin, teaching them how they could use it in their classrooms. And so that's, I think, maybe part of what we were just talking about as far as expanding the presence of climate change in curricula across Wisconsin and across the US from K through 12 as well. But my question was, I know you mentioned that this report, as it becomes completed in the next 2 years, could be used as sort of a model for other universities. I know that I have some friends who are in the student government at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and they're working very diligently on a similar proposal right now. And I was just wondering if there is thought for any future coalition amongst like the Big Ten schools or something to use the information that you guys have collected and share that out with others and vice versa. I just think
oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all.
No, there is a sort of broader sort of divestment coalition, and we actually worked on this independently because we wanted to put in language about procurement. But hopefully, once this passes and we get publicity about this, I think this will start, getting a sort of network together that includes not only conversations about divestment, but also about, sort of greening our procurement processes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
There's question about. So I asked a question about contact for the staff group that's working on this issue. It's just the secretary of the academic staff has gotten a copy of the resolution and has introduced it before the academic staff assembly. So, and I suddenly can't remember. No, what's his last name? Jake.
Boy, my coffee wore off about 15 minutes ago, so I'm gonna help on that. Hang on a sec. Jake Smith.
Okay. Smith. All right.
I have thinking about Nancy's question about how we can advance this on the short time scale. I think that the conversation we want to have is a practical welcoming all people conversation about this. There's a narrative which is going around that we didn't work sufficiently with the foundation on this, and from our perspective, it's not true. We've reached out. They were a big presence at our town hall. There was a lot of question asking and answering that included the foundation in it. We haven't been hostile to them in any way that, at least that in my perception. So I think that this is not, it's not an oppositional thing right now. I think that, and I think that we should try to avoid attempts to frame it in that way, even within our institution.
Yeah, and I think that, we are specifically working with the Nelson Institute to host another town hall about moving forward that will include all these voices in the conversation too. And it's open to folks from the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation as well, and also Office of Sustainability for how to implement anything should this resolution pass.
Since I really don't understand faculty governance the way I should, could you tell me what the possible outcomes are on Monday? Like what are the possible what comes nexts?
Yeah, so it could either pass. It could, I think, sometimes have a delayed vote. That's when I forget that you're the Roberts Rules expert, Noah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So basically, it could pass. It could pass in an amended form. It could fail, or it could be postponed. Those are the options. We'll push hard against postponement. And I think that we're willing to accept various amendments as they arise, assuming that they don't compromise the essential sort of therefore clauses of the resolution. I think that, don't want to jinx us. I think that we, in terms of the wide range of pushback that we were expecting, we have not received as much as we were expecting. And that it will be apparent very early in the Senate's discussion of this, whether there has been a coordinated attempt to organize resistance in between the town hall and now. So it'll come out very quickly whether someone's been whipping votes on the other side, in terms of who lines up to speak and whether they have prepared materials. And if that doesn't happen, then this may come out as being kind of a non-event, in which case we move quickly towards what Steph has been working hard on and talking on, which is the next step town halls about implementation.
And the thing too, also, the university committee seems to be, as far as I can tell, in support of this. And they're the ones who can form ad hoc study committees after this. So should this pass, then I hope that they will move rapidly on performing and creating an ad hoc study group so that some report can get put out really rapidly.
I don't know if this is the right context to bring up this question, but do you know how to bring up the dialogue of climate change with lower class populations? The issues of climate change is very important to me, and I came from a lower class background, and that climate change isn't discussed too much. And I'm happy to be here and hear everyone invested in talking about these issues. But a part of me really wants to, learn how to bring up these conversations with, family and friends without feeling ostracized or different. So I want to know if you have any suggestions or ideas, or if anyone in the group have any comments on that.
One thing we cite too in our FAQ, and you're free to follow that link, is sort of the very disparate impacts that climate change is likely to have, and it's going to affect poor and minority communities the most. And so I think that's one thing that, not necessarily to say, oh, it's all because of climate change, but when people are talking about things like, sort of disparate health outcomes because of COVID or something like that, that's exacerbated by climate change. So all of that too, you can talk about how this is making a disproportionate share of just regular risks even worse. And so that might be a way to sort of bring that up. I have a friend who works as a community justice organizer in Detroit. And he's been working on some of the water shutdowns, which thankfully actually they stopped with. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but Detroit had this water shutoff thing for just, I think it was like the largest water shutoff in the country. That's happening in a lot of different cities. And it was because people couldn't pay for their water and they're in debt. But as a result, right, people can't do many different regular things, like cool themselves down in the summer, like, have access to safe foods. And the necessity of water for this is even higher when you have rapid changes in climate. And so all of these types of problems that communities face, they're just regular justice problems, they're made worse by climate change. And I think that's one way to sort of talk about it. Does that help at all? I don't know.
Yeah. If I could pitch in there, I think that people who've been marginalized by society in one way or another already know that they're going to get the short end of the stick with whatever crisis happens, whether it's an environmental crisis or a social crisis. That's the expectation. But I think that what's really powerful about climate change is that a lot of the stuff that you would do to mitigate and to adapt to climate change is actually stuff which is good. For marginalized communities, whether it's marginalized by class or marginalized by race or marginalized by other dimensions. Anyhow, when you talk about things like improving public transit or public health infrastructure, or things like that, the language that goes into policy about this is often co-benefits, right? It's often like you would do this stuff anyhow if you had sort of broader health and equity outcomes in mind. That's not always true, but it's often true. It's often true that many of the things that you would want to do with climate change are things that you would want to do anyhow. So I think that it's not just, it's going to hit you hardest, which I think is part of the picture, but like, don't you want this stuff anyhow? Isn't this the world you would want to live in anyhow? Doesn't this fit in with the justice advocacy that you may be doing or the personal hardship that you may be experiencing?
Yeah.
Just one last thing, looking at the shift in attitudes over time and climate change, one of the things which has shifted noticeably is that the number of people who report that they've had a personal experience with the consequences of climate change has gone up considerably. And if you were to look in Texas, for instance, in terms of like who's been suffering most from the recent freeze, no surprise about who it is that's suffering most. And so then starting from that position of visceral experience, like this is not a distant thing, it's happening now, you're getting hit by it now, it's going to make life more fragile in a lot of ways. So let's do this stuff, let's get together and do this stuff that we want to do anyhow.
Michael, just really quickly building off of what Noah said, I think everyone comes to this for different reasons and from different experiences. And for everyone, understanding how your experience is shaped by climate change is central. And so it's not that you have to talk to people. I mean, I'll say this about, I teach like a climate change course, and it's not like starting with climate change gets you very far with anyone. You know, it's figuring out what people have experienced that let them think about what this means for them and their loved ones. And so thinking for yourself about, who you'd want to talk to and about what, and what you can connect to, right? That will let people think about this not as something that's really useless to talk about at this moment, right? And you'll know what that is, I think, when you hear people talking about it. But Steph was talking about this a little bit. There's a really big literature, for example, on heat and what it means that cities are getting so hot, and everything that we understand about why they're getting hot and what the consequences are for people when they get hot. And so I think just finding the place where you feel like people are having a conversation where you can just say, hey, just let me add a like an edge to that you may not have cared about before, but that I care about, and here's why I care about it. That personal link, I think, too, can also be really powerful in talking to people.
Thank you all for the responses and the very insightful knowledge and info.
Thank you for the question. That was a great question.
And actually, this is, I don't even know if this is a question, but this is kind of based on something I might have misheard earlier in this talk, and also, language of, but basically, climate change, I maybe misheard this, but just the usage of the term climate change and possibly changing that to better fit, or not better fit, but like try to appease to other people and not use the so-called dirty word. And when I hear the idea of that, I kind of just like feel a little irritated or annoyed, because I think whether you want to call it this or that, people are just gonna make it the new word, a dirty word. I mean, global warming, I feel like was the, first term that came up. And once that became, well, also we, made more discoveries, but once that became like that word, it was, people started using climate change, and now that's the terrible term. So I don't know if there's really any way to not irritate people or not create a new dirty word, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
what I'm
no,
saying.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I brought it up mostly as an example of how even folks who are opposed to the idea of climate change, just as a reactionary kind of thing, are still talking substantially about responses to climate change. They're just not framing it in their heads as climate change, because that creates such a, I don't know, such a feeling of opposition, but they are having those conversations nevertheless.
Logic schism is one word used to describe what it creates.
Okay, I've never
Yeah.
heard that before.
It's where two people think they're having the same conversation, but they're having different conversations.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, Alana, you might recognize that one. Good to see you,
That
by the way.
explains so much about my own personal history.
And that reminded me of something of what you said earlier. Should I call you Noah, Professor Feinstein?
You call me Noah.
About how we should not allow the conversation to be about whether or not this is something that needs to be paid attention to and is critical, but rather like, what are the different pathways that we can take to address it? Like that is where the conversation should be. And it just made me think of the same thing that Michael was saying about how that we shouldn't even allow it to be thought of as a dirty word or whatever. We should just like, stand our ground and establish, okay, this is a very, serious and critical thing. And we can discuss different opinions on how we're going to move forward, but we are not going to discuss whether or not this is serious. And it just makes me think of like, I studied abroad this last year in Germany for the year. And there I feel like the conversation is a lot more in that realm of like, you talk to someone, they're like, well, of course, obviously, it's clearly a very critical issue. And then you can discuss from there on out. What differs on party lines is how to address it and how much resources to invest in it. But even like the conservative party there, the CDU party, is like, that's the current one in power with Angela Merkel, and they're very much still in line with, strong forward action on it. So, and then the Green Party would be like off the charts liberal here. So it's just interesting coming back here and having gained that new perspective, how everything feels. Like I feel that shift so clearly in political spectrum, but agreed with everything that was said. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that, I mean, my probably most conservative class in terms of the students is my advanced contracts class. And I just have all of these exercises where it's just a given. I say, okay, look, because of climate change, if you're, working as general counsel for a company, you need to plan around potential risks, right? Like you're not gonna, if there's gonna be increased typhoons, but your only source of like vanilla is this one island, you're gonna have to, face that, and you have to plan around like both your business practices, but also what kind of contracts language you're gonna have to take, to take that into account. And so I think that it's a way of sort of getting around the sort of debate about whether or not it's real and making them realize, yes, this has consequences, and it has consequences in all sorts of areas that they might not have thought of before.
I don't mean to jump in here. Hi, Steph. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew. I'm fairly new faculty here at UW, and I missed the first 20 minutes of this. So if I'm asking something that has been covered, I apologize. I know the UW-Madison Faculty Senate has decades, if not generations, of history and background. Could you just articulate a little bit about sort of your working theory and philosophy of what the Faculty Senate's role could, should, will be, and what it means to take a policy position on something over which the faculty doesn't have authority? So I'm sure people disagree about this, but could you just articulate how you think about it?
So I think about things less, I guess, trying to think of how to put it. Me and Noah might have different ideas about this. For me, I tend to think of things as an advocate because I teach at the law school. So I think of this as a potential tool for persuasion into action. So I think of it as, look, when there's a faculty senate resolution that's passed, there's some media attention on it. There's also some kind of sort of persuasive leverage we can use out of this. And that can actually translate into action through both subsequent working groups, this increased attention, and the creation of momentum. Moreover, it also lays the groundwork for future kind of actions, right? We can point to this and say, well, consistent with this resolution, we should do this and this and this. So that's how I think of it, but that's, again, coming at it from a very lawyerly kind of point of view. Noah.
I don't disagree with that. I think that that's really important. I have two thoughts on this. One of which is that at this university, although it's diminished somewhat in the past decade or two, faculty actually still have a lot of control at various levels. Although not all of that is concentrated in the faculty senate, what symbolic action at the faculty senate level is tells other organs of shared governance what they can or might do on the basis that Steph has just laid out. So if we establish this is a normal thing and a reasonable thing for shared governance bodies to think about and act on at the faculty senate level, then other shared governance bodies around the university, places where faculty and staff do have power, become places where climate change might become an issue of action. In terms of the symbolic nature of the action, I think that has two potential impacts. One of them is contributing to, this is overused, right? But contributing to shifting the Overton window, the window of what is reasonable to talk about at a broader social level. Because we're a relatively prominent organization, institution, our action on this, and not a particularly exciting one where this stuff is concerned. We're not always the first mover, although we have been in the past. By planting a flag and saying we're doing this is one bigger step towards making it a normal thing to do in society, to take action as an organization / institution. And so we're also trying to make that cultural shift around the university. This is why, like, faculty senate resolutions on things like our shared future, land acknowledgements and things like that, things which at some level can seem purely symbolic. One thing that those represent is an attempt to shift our culture as an organization, to think about and acknowledge and recognize various forms of wrong and injustice and problems in the world, so that they can inform our own actions at different levels.
And I can sort of re-give that example of, I've seen things translate also into direct action, like the sort of faculty senate resolution on supporting LGBTQ supportive healthcare. That led to the creation of a working group, which I wasn't on faculty senate when that resolution was passed, but then I was in the working group. And that working group report led to Becky Blank actually requesting that the Employee Trust Fund Agency in Wisconsin remove the trans healthcare exclusion that's in our medical coverage, and also to sort of reduce the cost for HIV positive PrEP medications. So that it came about as this part of this longer process.
So I guess to wrap up, there is some real action that the faculty control through the Senate and other things. But also we see this work as prefatory to real action by laying sort of administrative groundwork, a theoretical groundwork, and a cultural groundwork.
I ask these questions from sort of the loyal skeptic perspective. So the examples that you gave strike me as things that were less policy prescriptive than the current resolution. And so
it was policy prescriptive. use expressly, look, get rid of the exclusion. That's a policy prescription.
And the resolution itself isn't particularly policy prescriptive. It asks for things like we need a task force to figure out how we're going to do divestment in 5 years, and we call on the, So I'm sorry. I think that let's hear the rest of the point.
Yeah, I didn't mean to. Sorry, jump in like that. I have a problem with that. Sorry.
No, I don't disagree that I think the Faculty Senate has a powerful prophetic activist voice. And I also sense that sometimes it dilutes its own voice if it gets perceived as nitpicking about what solution is the right solution. I am happy to be wrong, and I'm sure there are people who disagree with me, and I'm not a senator and all of those lovely things. But so just hearing you talk about those dynamics, I think, is helpful for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that we shouldn't be weighing in on everything. This, at least in our view, is such a critical issue at this moment. And we won't even be the leaders on this because there are many institutions that are way ahead of us on this.
I think that, again, this is like both Steph and I approach this from like an any and all worthwhile action at this point. I've been living with this George Counts quote lately. Although college professors, if not too numerous, perform a valuable social function, society requires a great number of persons who, while capable of gathering and digesting facts, are at the same time able to think in terms of life, make decisions, and act. George Counts, man, he doesn't play. But I think that there's a question in which, where climate change is concerned, we feel an urgency to not try to find the perfect action. And that we could worry about modifying our strategy slightly, or worry about diluting our power slightly. But if those worries stop us from doing something, using the levers that we have, it feels like a bad trade-off.
I want to thank Steph. Thank you so much. Noah, thank you so much. We're so grateful that you shared with us, that you're helping us think through what the vote means and what it doesn't mean, what other opportunities there are for people to get involved now and in the future, what this might look like going forward.